Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining this morning on this ConnectIT 365 Q2 partner training. My name is Nicholas. With me on the call is Richard Lensing. He'll be walking you through some best practices on how to set up our ConnectIT 365 integration suite. A bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you have questions, please ask them during the call through the questions tab. I will collect them and we will answer them near the end of the session. You will be provided with a recording after we close the call. And please share your feedback through the questionnaire you will see after the end of the session. Some other upcoming training sessions today I wanted to point out. So ConnectIT is coming up at 1 this afternoon. We have the ConnectIT Magento connector training hosted by our partner ConnectIT. ShipIT 365 is to follow at 2:15, and we will finish off today with a session on ApproveIT, also one of our new offerings in the portfolio. So if you have the time, you haven't registered yet, or you want to forward it to one of your colleagues who might be interested in attending, the URL is down at the bottom, idyn.nl/news, and just click through to the registration page. That being said, I think we can get started. I will now pass presenter rights over to Richard, who'll take it away.
Okay, let me share my monitor. So welcome to the partner session, training session for ConnectIT 365 for Q2. Last week we had the highlights, and I will be going into the new functionality more in depth in this session to see how you can set it up. Well, of course, we have our benefits as always for our app. Connect, of course, mainly focuses as a toolbox for interfacing between other apps, or even in Business Central Hotel with our intercompany functionality, and allows you to create them on the go instead of needing to program everything. For today's session, we will be focusing on the release or on the release of a previous week. That's actually, it should be 22.6.15 for BC22 anyway. In this release, we had the addition of the maximum number of retry attempts to allow us to retry existing import or export entries without any user intervention, which can be interesting if you have some logs in your database to retry again, so that the process can still run completely automated. We have a setting to specify the maximum number of records per array, which allows us to split up export messages or export entries into multiple entries to make sure that the message size is limited, which can help some with some performance issues, especially if you're working with a lot of web services. In the table monitor, we added support for the rename database trigger, and in such a way that we can allow both the old record or the extract output and the current or the new output. And well, I just mentioned intercompany. Intercompany is now also added for the endpoint functionality. And while that it might not really be useful to have multiple endpoints for intercompany in the same definition. You can use it for synchronization scenarios where you have synchronization in two other companies in the same environment and web services to another environment or another tenant. On the import side, we added plain text support for importing in blob fields. That was actually already available a couple of weeks ago, but in this session I will show you what that looks like. And we also added some support for filtering on subnode elements. Previously, we only supported filtering on the direct node for the data item that we defined, but we now also allow to filter on the subnodes. And the last part before we start some Q&A, we also have some new functions that I will briefly show you. For the get current value, that's mainly focused on import, and from and to base64 are for conversions from and to base64 strings. So let's start with the maximum number of retry attempts. For each part of functionality, I will switch back to the BC client to show you how it works. But first of all, let's see where we can actually set it up. So in our general setup, in our connected setup card, we have an option available to set the maximum number of retry attempts. That's a global setting that will be used for all imports and exports. So currently there is no configuration that can be done on specific import and export definitions. The default value for that is 0, and that means that it will, if it fails, it won't retry the import or export entries again. So that's basically the same as before. However, if we set it up with a number of attempts, like in the screenshot on 5, it will allow up to a maximum of 5 attempts before actually stopping in a failure. And to let us know if that's the case, we also added that field on the import and export entries and also on the log entries to know if there were any issues in between. So if we take a look at the Business Central client, if we go to the general setup, we can see that it is available over here, and here is already set to 5. So here we can define how many attempts are allowed as a global setting. And what we can see, I already have some entries over here where the maximum is already, or in this case, not yet reached. Previously it was set to 3 apparently. So here we can see the current number of retries that were tried. This functionality will look at, or the job queue, the task scheduler for ConnectIT will process this and takes a look at all entries in error which have not exceeded a maximum number of attempts, and will set back the failure state. So for each execution of the job queue entry, 1 attempt is done. So if I go to the job queue entries, it's probably on hold right now, or maybe in an error. Yeah, it's currently on hold. Here I have the task scheduler job queue for the exports. Now, if I will try this in the foreground ones, that should allow for 1 execution. Yes. And if we go back to the entries, we will now see that the failure is gone. However, for each export entry, new background sessions have been started or task scheduler tasks have been created that will try to process these entries, and we can see they are set back to failure, and the number of retry attempts is increased. So if I will start the job queue entry once again, it will count up to 5, and once it reaches 5, then it will ultimately stop in the failure and not process those entries again. The same is applied to the import entries, where we can also see that the number of attempts that have already been tried to process the entry. Then for the next part, we're taking a look at the maximum number of records that are exported per array. Once again, default value for this is 0. This setting can be found on the definition, the export definition card, in a new section called the processing rules. And we also have added the use endpoints option, or we move that to the processing rules as well. If we keep this maximum records per array value at 0, then we will simply create one single export entry, provided that we have an array set up in the root data item. If we set this to a value other than 0, then we will take a look how many records have already been collected for an export entry, and if we exceed that maximum records counter, then we will start with a new export entry. So what we can see for this, we're going back to the Business Central client. And here we can see, if we look at this definition, we have set up this maximum records per array with 30. So it is important to note that if we don't have this array option available on the root data item, then this setting won't matter at all, because of course we will generate a new export entry for each record. However, if we have set this up, normally this would generate one single export entry. However, right now we're limiting each export entry to 30 records. So in this environment, I believe I have something like 140 items, so this should generate 5 exports, and we can test that by simply processing this manually. So I have set up no filter over here, and I export all items. And we can see there are, well, 6 notifications, but 5 export entries have been created. If we take a look at those export entries, then we should see that this starts at the beginning of the data set. And here we continue with the rest. So this would be a record 61. And this would be record 91. And that's the last one. And this contains a little bit less than 30 records. In this case, I will delete these. And now do the same thing, but for instance, set it to 15. And let's take a look how many exports are generated this time. Well, not really surprising, but we have 10 export entries in this case. So this is a simple setting to allow us to split up the exports that are generated. For files, this probably doesn't really make sense, but for web services, this can come quite in handy, especially if you set it up in a way that we use table monitors to track changes, but we only want to export it in the evening. So by the time we want to export it, and we have a lot of records available to export, then we can make sure that we still limit the size of our web service requests. And if there are any failures, then we also can make sure that we can limit the data that returns an error. So, and here we can see this. Previously, this was in the second export entry available. Now it's the third. And if we go to the last one, we can see this. Well, it appears that we almost have 150 available. And just to show you, if we set this back to 0, which is the default value, and then export, then we will return to the old way that it works, and then all items or all records will be collected in the same export entry. Next, we have our rename option in our export table monitor. So we have added the monitor rename as a Boolean field in the table monitors. However, it is important to note that this is a bit different than before. Normally with the insert, modify, and delete, you would only select a single option to check for or track the changes. However, because the rename has some values that can be important for the old record value and the new record value, so we both have the extract and the rec to consider in the output, we have combined some options. So to get the extract output, we can set it up in such a way that we select the rename monitor and the delete monitor. And for the new values, we can set it up in such a way that we either use the insert or modify monitor or both to get the latest output. Since we have the old values to consider, so the extract values, this will process as a real-time export, the same as we have set it up with monitor of deletions, since that also handles the extract. So taking a look at that in the Business Central client, we can see here we have two separate definitions set up, one for the old values and one for the new values. Both contain the same definition lines at the very least, but we can see that the monitor here is set up with a delete. And if we go to the next one, we can see that here we have selected the insert and modification. This is a definition on the vendor bank account. And in the vendor bank account, well, that's an example where you can find a rename. For instance, if you change the code, because that's a value that's part of the primary key. And once you change a value of the primary key, that will trigger a rename instead of a modify. And to take a look at this, we can go to the vendors. And let's take a look if we have a vendor over here with a bank account. Yeah. So here we have 2 bank accounts available. And let's check the second one. So this code is part of the primary key of this record. If we take a look at the records, then we will see that the primary key consists of the vendor number and the code for the bank account. So changing either one of those will trigger a modify. However, we don't have the vendor available over here to actually change, but we can modify the code. So let's make something completely different. So this is the default message that you get for Business Central, which shows us that this is in fact a rename, because it will check for related records to also change based on table relations. If we choose yes, that will trigger the rename. And since it is a real-time export, we also get some notifications over here that we have some exports available. This would only be visible, these separate notifications, if you have set them to manually. So normally this is something that you probably won't see. However, for demoing purposes, I've set these to manually to make sure that we can see the contents of those entries. So let's go back to the definition and actually take a look at those entries. And here we can actually see that here we have the value for the new one, for the new values. So here we can see this code, and in the previous definition we should be able to find the old value. So this way, this could be useful for synchronization purposes mostly, if you want to make sure that you both track the old value and new value, to allow you to, for instance, delete old data and insert new data in another environment or another company or another application completely. The next part is the intercompany endpoint. So in the Q1 release, we mentioned that we released the endpoint functionality at the beginning of the year to allow us to send data to another company or multiple companies in the same environment without it leaving the Business Central environment. So in that way, we don't need any external sources or web services or Azure storage, for instance, but we can keep it within the same database. So we added support for that method on the export definition card. However, we now also added the support for the endpoints. And as mentioned, multiple endpoints within the company method for the same definition, that doesn't really make sense because we can already define all companies that we want to export the data to or import the data in a single configuration. However, once again, looking at synchronization scenarios, this can be useful if you want to synchronize to different environments, different tenants, and to different companies. So we want to create the export and get the data once. However, we want to push the data into multiple directions. So if we take a look at this, here I've set this, or the definition for this up. So in this case, we would use the mixed method, which allows us to use multiple endpoints with different methods. If we set it up with the method intercompany, we can still use endpoints. However, in that case, you can only select endpoints with method intercompany. So in this case, we use mixed. We can see in the processing rules that we have selected the use endpoints, and we can see that we have multiple endpoints here, one of which is the intercompany method. So let's take a look at that endpoint. And here we can see the same options as we have available if we were to select the intercompany method on the export definition. So we have options available over here to either copy to all companies or all other companies. So that excludes the current company, of course, where we can set up one single definition. Here we can also, of course, check which intercompany definitions, import definitions are available in the selected company. We can set it up in such a way that we export it to a single company. So that's the current setup here. We selected a different company. Here we can actually select the same company, which sometimes can also be useful if we want to update data. And in that way, we can set to a specific company that still uses this import definition number. And the third option is that we have this list available where we can select multiple companies, which can be useful if you want to sync the data to multiple companies, but not all companies in the same environment. And once again, we can simply check all available import definitions that filters on the method in the company and set to active. In this case, I only have 2 companies available, so it makes sense to only export to a single company. Now this is combined with 2 other endpoints, so the same data is collected once from the business center environment and then exported to multiple directions, one to the intercompany company, one to a web service, which is set up here. And this is a web service that will actually fill on an FTP server. So these are the same options that you would see normally on the definition itself. So if we export this, here we actually have the definition that's based on the items. We can actually see that we have 2 items over here. And just as we would normally do, we could export this. Of course, we could also schedule this, and in this case, it is actually also scheduled to run. Well, I will simply use the same filter that will generate 2 export entries for each method or for each endpoint. So if we take a look at the export entries here, so we already had those 4 previously available. I mentioned that we have 2 export entries for each method or for each endpoint. So we should have 6. However, you only see 4 here but that's because the intercompany endpoint entries are already processed, and the rest will return an error in this case. And we can also see that in this case in the log once again. So here we can actually see that we have 2 successful entries, and that's linked to that endpoint. So to check what happened to that data, we need to go to or switch the company. And since I'm pretty sure that the job queue in this company isn't running, we should have some entries available. So these 2 were already there from last week. And here we have our new entries available. So normally these would be processed by the job queue entry, the dot scheduler for the imports in this company, or if we have set the export to real time, then it would process immediately with a background session. Then we have some functionality in the imports. So first of all, we have the import for plain text in the blob field, which in its use is pretty straightforward. However, it's good to know what it actually does, because blob field imports allows for multiple types of input. So there are 4 steps in the check that's done. First of all, a check is done if the input is a base64 string. In that case, it will decode the string and write it to the blob. Next, it checks if it's a data URI string, where it gets the base64 part, and also decodes that. The third option is if it's data that needs to be retrieved from external URL. In that case, it would do an HTTP request. And if none of those options return true, then we will consider it a plain text. And in that case, the plain text will simply be imported into the blob. So as an example, we have the work description on the sales order, or the sales header, which is a blob field. And there we have an example file available with some plain text. So let's go to the imports. And here we have the import plain text in blob. So the definition here is quite simple. We generate a new order number, and we set the document type to 1 to order, and we validate the customer, the sell to customer number. We fill in the reference, and we set the work description. If we run an import for this, then we will see that the contents of this is simply plain text. In this case, a long Dutch string and some, just to make sure that it's a long string. If we process this, previously this would return an error in previous versions. Now it's simply processed. So if we look up the sales order, and then I actually need to take a look. It should probably be this one. And here we can see that the work description is simply filled in with that text. Nothing really special, but something that was completely missing in the previous version of the product. And then we have some filter options. So previously, while using the imports, we only allowed the filter to be selected from the data item node. However, in most cases in XML or JSON, most import messages are more complex than that, and some data might be in some subnodes, and sometimes you need to make a decision to whether or not to import something based on that data in those subnodes. So previously we were limited to all elements directly in the node that was linked or matched to the data item. So in this example, we have the sales header linked to the root node, and in that case we could only filter on the elements directly below the data item. However, if we have helpers with elements in them, so we have multiple nodes or subnodes here, we couldn't select or filter based on those values. This is now changed so that we can in fact do this, and this will also allow us to process certain nodes within arrays in a smarter way. So for instance, the example that we will see in a moment has multiple parties related to a sales order, where we need to find the node with only the bill to customer. However, in those nodes, we also have the sell to and ship to customers available. So if we actually take a look and actually show the file that we use as an example here. So this is the same structure that we have available over here. So here you can see that we would set the data item to the sales header in the root. Then we only have these two elements directly below it. However, we also have an array over here for the parties, and that contain nodes for the bill to, ship to, and sell to customer. And here we can make sure that we only filter on a certain part. So in this case, we want to filter on the type of bill to make sure that we get the bill to customer over here. This could also be used in a similar fashion to actually define the node multiple times with different filters. So that we can set the bill to and sell to customer, for instance. However, we can then set those to different fields. In this scenario, in this example, we have only specified the bill to customer. So if we take a look at how that is set up, we're going to this definition. So here we can see that same structure. The root is set to the sales header. We have some lines over here, and here we have the subnodes for the sales header. And we can see we have one filter over here on the helper, and that's set to the type that filters on bill to, which means that these two nodes should be ignored completely. And here we can also see that we have more filter options that we would have previously in the previous version. So, and for the rest of the definition is simply we create a new sales document, in this case a sales order, and also set up some constants for the line. So we don't do anything that's really special over here, but we do set the party ID, we link that to the bill to customer now. This would generate an error if the filter wouldn't work, because I have set up some party IDs over here, some customers that are not in this environment. So previously, in the previous version, we would loop through all these nodes and ultimately process all nodes in order, resulting in the last matching element to be processed. So without this filter, we would have processed this value as the bill to customer number. However, if we now import this, this one, so same file. Since we're in an interactive session, we will also get to change the question to change the bill to customer number, because we already validated the sell to customer number before we selected those nodes. However, it did find an element to fill in the bill to customer number, which is different from the sell to customer number. So this is what you would also normally get if you change the bill to customer number manually on an order. So we do yes. In this case, it seems like we have yes. Okay. Yeah, and that's the problem. I already have this available. Okay. Just to make sure, in this case, I actually should retry it and actually get a new sales order. In this case, I already had the external identifier in my imported records. So once again, we should have this, or we shouldn't get the question to change the dimension values. I believe I have used a different number series for this. This should be the one. And here we can see that the bill to customer is set to a different customer. Here we can't actually see what the customer number is, but if we do a drop down on this, we can see that that is linked to that bill to customer number that we have had specified in the import file. So that means that currently the order is processed, well, with the customer number that's in the root node, and after filtering, it only checked the first node in that array to make sure that we get the bill to customer. And last part for this session are the new functions. So in total, 3 new functions in this release. One is to get the current value that's used for import, to allow us to get default values that aren't necessarily already available before the import, but during import, that we can check to make sure that we can make some decisions what values to process, and we can see an example in a moment. And we have 2 functions available to convert from and to base64 strings to make it easier if something needs to be converted. That can be used in both import and export. So first of all, we start with the easiest ones. So those are the base64 strings that I have defined in the export. So here I've set up two lines over here with functions, one with a to base64 and one with a from base64 function. We have some optional parameters available where we can decide how to process it if we don't need to define those. So for instance, if we don't set up text encoding, it will default to UTF-8. The code page will default to 0 and line breaks will be set to false if we don't provide those. And this is this uses the comfort base64 code unit in Business Central. So it also uses the defaults from that code unit as well. In the from base64 string, from base64 function, we have two parameters available because we don't need the insert line breaks parameter over there because it will already decide if it contains line breaks and convert it back from there. So what do we see over here? We have a customer available over here where we have the customer number, we have the customer name. We have specified the customer name once again, but with conversion to base64. And here we have a constant value that will be converted back to plain text. So let's try and see what we will get. I will set a filter to make sure that we only get one single customer, one single export. And let's see what that contains. So here we can see, of course, customer number, the normal customer name, the converted base64 string, and here we can actually see that I've used a different customer before to set that base64 string, so that will return back to a plain text. And then we also have the getCurrentValue function. Now, for this example, I've once again set up a definition for a sales order. And in this case, also a new sales order. So we set the document type, we generate the document number. And here you can see a line discount. So what this could be used for instance, is if you have an import for a sales order and we have some nodes available for the lines where the line discount is either given or set to 0, but once we create the sales lines, we will also, or we could also get a default discount that's set in the customer prices or in the customer prices and discounts in this case. And that could be used to make sure that we get the default back. So to take a look at this, we will be using this import. So we have an external order number, we have a customer number. This customer has been set up with some discounts for certain items, and we have some lines available over here. So we have 3 order lines, 3 different item numbers, and we have a unit price and we have a discount percentage available. However, this is an important one. So here we have a discount of a 0. However, the default will probably return 10% discount. However, if we process this, especially if we process this after validating the rest of the elements, this will set the discount to 0. That might be useful. That might actually what we want if this should always be used. But there could also be a scenario that we want to make sure that we have the default discount if this discount is 0. Now, if this element wasn't here at all, then we wouldn't have a problem because the discount would simply be skipped because we look at missing elements before processing. However, since we currently have the discount and it's set to 0, but we might want to process a discount anyway. So what we will be doing is set up some functions over here. And first of all, we store the incoming discount in a temporary value. And then we use the getCurrentValue function. Now for this function, we only need to define the field number that we want because it uses the current record ref that we're using. So in this case, it's used in a node where the sales line record is active. So we already created the sales line at this point, and we also validated some fields like the item number and the unit price. So we should already have the discount available, the default discount from Business Central, I should say, in this record, which is field number 27. That discount will also be stored as the current discount in a temporary value, and then we get back the original discount. In this case, it could also be done in a separate constant value, but in this case, it can also be done in a single for a single line. So we go back to the original discount from the import, and we do the if equal function. That's something that that was released with Q1, and here we check if this import discount value is 0, and if that's 0, then we will check the current discount, and if it's not 0, then we will use the import discount. So if you process this, so once again, we see 3 lines over here. All 3 lines have the discount per element. However, we can see that the first one contains 7.5, this contains 15, and this will return 0. So this should give another result due to our functions that we use. So this is processed. And now let's check the sales order. I should actually check this time what we actually imported. So yeah, that's that one. So what we can currently see, we see the first 2 lines with the line discount from the import file. However, we still have a line discount available over here for the 3rd line, and that's simply because if we manually would do this, it will return that same discount value, in this case 10%. So that's a way to use the current value to simply make sure that if we have some default set by some business logic, that we can get that value to use in our own logic as well, to make sure that we don't simply set everything back to the import value. And that's another way of filtering actually, by using those functions and compared values. So that's all there is for this session. So now we have some options to ask questions. As mentioned by my colleague already, we have some sessions later this afternoon available that you can see on screen. I don't know if there are any questions available right now.
Not at the moment, Richard.
Okay.
So,
then
yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was going to say if there are any questions afterwards, it's probably best to contact sales at idyn.nl.
Yeah, exactly. If anything comes to mind, or if you're facing challenges during any implementations, just let us know at sales@idyn.nl and we'll help you along the way. So I'll close this call for now. Thanks for joining, everybody. Thank you, Richard. And then
no problem.
we'll see you on the next one. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.